Good morning and welcome to Rose Red Homestead, and thank you so much for joining our community for this video today. Our community focuses on self-reliance, improving food security in our homes, and working more toward emergency preparedness. Lately we've been focusing on safe canning, which is what today's video is about, and we deeply appreciate how many of you have helped us get that word out by subscribing to our channel and by liking the videos if indeed you do like them, and then by sharing them. So today's topic is how to annihilate botulism, and I'm going to start by showing you this. This is a baked potato wrapped in foil, and it has been at room temperature for now several hours. In 1994 in El Paso, Texas, where actually I used to live and raise my children when they were smaller, there was a Greek restaurant who they baked several potatoes and left them in the foil and left them out on their countertop for 3 or 4 days, and then used those potatoes in making a potato dip. Well, 30 people that came to eat in that restaurant got botulism illness. 30 people. Fortunately, no one died, but some of them were very critically ill for quite a long time. So botulism in potatoes wrapped in foil, how could that possibly happen? Well, we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Before 1950, the incidence of botulism in the United States was between 3,000 and 4,000 cases per year. And then in about 1950 was when the USDA got involved and said, you know, this has just got to stop. Most of these cases are foodborne illness, and many of them, the large majority, are from home canned food-borne illness. And so as they began testing and getting the research results out, that is what laid the foundation for the safe canning processes that we practice today. Now, since safe canning practices have been widely distributed, the incidence of botulism in the United States is now only about 100 per year. But it happens. A year and a half ago in Colorado, they had their first botulism death in over a decade. And so it still happens. And that's really, it's a good thing that the incidence has dropped from between 3,000 and 4,000 a year to 100 a year. That's the good news. The bad news on that is that it also helps people to conclude that because hardly anybody ever gets botulism anymore, we don't need to pay that much attention to the safe canning rules. Now, our community rejects that premise wholeheartedly. We know that botulism still exists. We know that it is a possibility, even a probability, when we can foods. So we're going to talk about how we can annihilate botulism, and in our own homes with our own canning, reduce that probability to 0. So we'll get right to it. The word botulism has come to mean 3 different things, and I want to clarify that. So, first of all, botulism often refers to the organism, the bacteria itself, whose name is really Clostridium botulinum. It's just called botulism. Also, botulism is a reference to the illness that you get. And the third is the botulism toxin itself. And so when people say botulism, it can mean any one of those 3 things. So we have to sort of keep things in context. When I'm talking about the organism today, I'm going to talk about Clostridium botulinum. And when I talk about the toxin, I'm going to say botulism toxin, so that you'll know. And then about the illness, I'm going to say botulism illness. So I'm going to use those 3 so you'll know which I'm talking about. So let's first of all talk about the life cycle of Clostridium botulinum. Know that Clostridium botulinum is found everywhere. it is probably in your house right this minute. It's in the soil, it's in dust, it's in the air. It's, according to Clemson University Extension, botulism is found on all of our food, all of it. Well, if that is the case and if it's so prevalent, then why on earth aren't we all dropping dead from botulism illness? The reason is the life cycle of Clostridium botulinum. The Clostridium botulinum that is found out there everywhere is in its spore stage. Now, spore, think of a spore as a tight little, like a capsule, like a big capsule that you take, like a vitamin capsule with that hard case on the outside. And so these botulism spores that are found everywhere really don't bother us very much, because we can ingest those spores and they go right into our acid stomach where they can't do a darn thing. They pass out of our body to live another day, and we're just fine. The exception is with infants. We have to be careful with infants age birth to 1 in what we do. We don't ever feed them honey, because sometimes honey contains those spores, the botulism, the Clostridium botulinum spores, which then can go to the next life stage in a tiny baby's gut and produce some difficulties. But for all of the rest of us, the spores don't hurt us at all. Now, those darn spores, they're so heat resistant, and so it takes a lot to destroy those spores. Now, when those spores get into a place where specific conditions exist, they shed that outer covering and they then begin the vegetative state. The vegetative state is where they grow, they eat, they reproduce, and they produce the botulism toxin. And it is that botulism toxin that is so deadly to humans. Well, obviously, they don't get in that stage very often because of those very special conditions. And remember that the spores are very heat resistant, and it takes a lot for them to break out of that spore stage and get to the vegetative stage where they create the damage. So let's look at those conditions. Here are the 5 most important conditions that have to be met for Clostridium botulinum to leave the spore stage and get into the vegetative state where it can produce that toxin. First of all, low acid. Then low or no oxygen. There has to be moisture present. There has to be a protein source. They have to eat something. So that protein source is the food that it's on. And then warm temperature, ambient temperature, the temperature outside on a sunny day, the temperature in your kitchen, the temperature in your pantry. Those are all warm enough temperatures for the Clostridium botulinum to move into the vegetative state. Now, low acid foods for canning, because this condition has to be met. So we have to be extra careful then with low acid foods. And the low acid foods that are approved for canning include fish, meats, vegetables, and beans. Now, in 20 years of records, the CDC has done a long study and determined that home canned vegetables are cause for the largest number of botulism toxin illness. So let's remember that this potato was baked in the oven and apparently did not destroy the spores of Clostridium botulinum. And I don't know about you, but I baked potatoes at about 350 degrees and still those spores were not destroyed. So think about that in terms of, if you've looked at our video on whether or not oven canning of dry foods is safe, this will help you make that decision, which we came to in that video. But in terms of this potato, let's go through those 5 conditions. Low acid, yes, potato is low acid. Low to no oxygen, the foil keeps new oxygen from getting into that potato, so yes. Moisture present, absolutely. That potato is moist. Protein source, yes. The potato was a protein source. So those Clostridium botulinum in their vegetative state had food they needed. And what about warm enough temperature? After it got out of the oven and was set on the counter for 3 or 4 days, that ambient temperature was the perfect incubating temperature. So, toxin was produced in foil-wrapped potatoes that had stayed out, and now the USDA recommends that it's still okay to bake potatoes wrapped in foil, but the minute they come out of the oven, that foil should come off. We should never store them in foil. We should never store them in an airtight container like a Tupperware container. They should be stored naked in the refrigerator, because remember, warm ambient temperatures, no, no, no. Refrigerator totally eliminates the possibility of the spores going vegetative and producing the toxin. Here's a selection of things I just pulled from our pantry shelf. We have chicken chunks, carrots, green beans, salmon, cherries, peaches, and applesauce. Now, let's think about those 5 conditions. Are these, when I pulled them from my pantry, we're going to go from the bottom up. Were they stored in warm temperature where the toxin could develop? Yes, they were. Is there a protein source in every one of these? Yes, there is. Is there moisture in every one of these? Absolutely. Is there low to no oxygen in every one of these jars? Yes. What about low acid? Which of these are low acid? Can we eliminate that condition on some of these? Yes, we can. If I take out the cherries, if I take out the peaches, if I take out the applesauce, these are all high acid foods. These are low acid foods. So these jars produce the exact conditions under which, if there were any spores on the foods in these jars, those would then move to the vegetative state and be producing toxin. So it is these foods, low acid foods, that we have to be sure that we properly annihilate every last one of those spores. It only takes 3 or 4 days on the shelf in meeting all of those conditions for toxin to form inside these jars after we've taken them out of the canner and put them in our pantry. So here is how we begin to annihilate this organism. We annihilate the spores of Clostridium botulinum in the canning process by thermal death. We kill those suckers off by getting the temperature up high enough that those spores are completely destroyed. Well, what are those temperatures? In the 1950s, when the USDA began their testing, they ultimately determined that the proper killing temperatures are between 240 degrees to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, which translates to 115 degrees to 121 degrees Celsius. And then those temperatures need to be held for a prescribed time. How do we do that? How do we get this jar of carrots so that the inside, the center of this jar where the food is, gets up to 240 to 250 degrees and is held there for the prescribed time that the USDA indicates? You know what? That's not easy. It's above the boiling point. So what's the boiling point where you live? Most of us are going to automatically say 212 degrees or 100 degrees Celsius, depending on whether it's Fahrenheit or Celsius, because that's what we're taught in our high school science classes, and that is right, provided we live at sea level. We live here on the Colorado Plateau in southern Utah at 5,000 feet in elevation. Our boiling point is 203, not 212 Fahrenheit. As elevation increases, boiling point decreases. And so that is why the USDA had to test everything. And their charts showing processing times and pounds pressure is so critical, because the only way we can get water up to that temperature is by putting it under pressure. Pressure and temperature are mathematically linked. If we know what the pressure is, we can calculate what the temperature is. And so if we have an indication of 1, in this case on this pressure canner, I have an indicator on a dial of what the pressure is on the inside of this pot. So I know that when the pressure reaches 13 pounds per square inch, which is the prescribed pressure at our elevation, that the temperature on the inside is in that kill zone between 240 and 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if you don't have a pressure dial, you probably then have a weight that fits over one of the parts of your canner. And those weights are generally either 10 pounds, which can be used at sea level up to about 1,000 feet, or 15 pounds, which is anything above that. We don't ever go over 15 pounds PSI because that's all we need at all elevations on Earth where people live in order to get into the kill zone. All right, so how can we possibly double check if we wanted to double check the temperature and match it with the pressure just to see? Would it be possible to actually do that? And you know what? Yes, it is, because that's exactly how the USDA tests their recipes and did their original testing on what the kill zone is. And this is the most efficient kill zone. I have this scientific piece of equipment that I bought that measures temperature inside a jar of food while it is being processed. And so I have run a number of tests where I put this little, it is called a data logger. And I'll put that data logger inside a jar right in the middle of the food. And this probe is what measures the food. It doesn't, you're not to stick it in the food, it just measures the food around it. And inside this capsule is a little computer that will track and record what the temperature is over time, every single minute. I've set it for measuring that temperature every single minute. And then I can look at that data and I can track what the temperature is inside food. And I did that, and I want to show you the results of this jar of green beans. Well, not this one, because I opened the one to get my logger out. A jar of green beans just exactly like this, where I put my data logger on the inside and I tracked the temperature over time. This is really important. So I have that data that I'm going to show you in just a second, but I want to tell you a couple of things that are really, really important. First of all, follow USDA guidelines for processing time and for the amount of pressure. That is the only way we're going to get enough kill time to create thermal death for the vegetative state of Clostridium botulinum. Secondly, and this is critical as you will see in just a moment, the cool down time is also very important. There is a reason why the USDA says don't touch your canner, turn the heat off and let it sit and cool down on its own. We have done a video on the Instant Pot Max for pressure canning. On the outside of that pot, I can visually see through the whole processing time the temperature inside that pot. And I feel secure if I can have either a pressure reading or a temperature reading on the outside of a pot, then I can calculate what's happening on the inside using a mathematical formula. But not trusting that completely, I tested the Instant Pot Max using this little data logger. And I'm going to show you one of the results on a pint jar of green beans and why the cool down time is so important. So we're going to go over to the door of my indoor pantry where I have that data set up, and we're going to take a look at it. This is a little bit sciencey, but I'm hoping I can explain it so that everybody can understand. This is the data printout from my first test with green beans. I ran 3 tests to make sure the results were all indicated safety. So here's what happens. This is the time. So every one of these is 2 minutes, and there was a measurement in between. So this is every minute by minute by minute. We started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and this is just a piece of the curve that I'm showing you, the most important piece. The whole curve was 2 hours from start to finish. I'm just showing you the middle part. And it ended at 2:56, so about an hour later. So this dark blue line right here is my tracker. This is my data logger temperature. So this is the temperature over time. The temperature increases and increases and increases. At this point right here is when I started timing, because it reached, this is when actually this was the max, or this would be also where my Presto would have reached 13 psi, is when I start the processing time. Between these two lines is the 20 minutes of processing time required by pints of green beans. So this to here represents 20 minutes of time, and this is what the temperature did. So it's still not hot enough right here when the timing started. And so it climbed and climbed and climbed, and here about 4 minutes later is where it hit the kill zone. Now this is Celsius. Here's 114, here's 116, so 115 is right here. That's the beginning of the kill zone. It translates to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it continued and continued and continued climbing. It got up as high as 244, and boom, the end of the 20 minutes occurred. The heat was turned off. Now watch what happens. The pink line indicates the duration of the kill time. So when the heat turned off, we're still in the kill zone and continued to be in the kill zone, even though the temperature was dropping fast here because the heat was off, for another 16 minutes. And then, of course, we were out of the kill zone, and it continued to drop until it dropped and dropped, and the pressure dropped, and I was able to then remove the jars from the canner. Now, the appropriate time for it to remain in the kill zone is 20 minutes. So 16 minutes is right here, and we have 18 minutes right here. So did we meet our 20 minutes of kill time? Yes, indeed we did. And so this was plenty enough kill time at the proper temperature for the green beans in those jars to all be safe to eat. From the data that I've collected myself and from the USDA recommendations, we now know how to reduce the probability to 0 that we are going to have any Clostridium botulinum spores left alive in our canned food if we follow their instructions. So safe canning means that we practice the process that causes those spores to have thermal death. That's the story. Knowledge is power. Understanding more about this big enemy to home canning completely does away with any fear that we have regarding Clostridium botulinum. I'm not a bit afraid of it because I know how to annihilate it, and it is by safe canning. I hope this helps you in your own canning. Thanks so much for being with us, and we will see you at our next video.